Thank you to Karine and Hiwaraat and Abdullah for organizing, and to GUQ for hosting as well. As an academic, I'm used to normally about 20 people in the room, and that's a good turnout, so yeah, this is pretty great. So let me begin. When we think about American empire and Islamophobia, our minds are inevitably drawn to recent conflicts in Iraq and Afghanistan, or to the growth of anti-Muslim sentiment and legislation in the United States. And rightly so, of course. The confluence of Islamophobia and American global power in the past 2 decades particularly has starkly illustrated how racial and religious animosity fuels military conquests and the border-crossing politics of fear and exclusion. Yet, as our first round table indicated, this is a story older than the 21st century global war on terror, or even the Cold War, or the many partitions, going back to the many partitions of the post-World War I era. All of these have been used as origin points in popular and academic writing, but I would suggest to understand the relationship between US empire and Islamophobia, we need to gaze back a bit further in time to a period where colonial empires, rather than nation states, were the norm. So for the next few minutes, I want us to consider this longer history and to tell you a story. It's a story that begins at the end of the 19th century, in 1898 to be precise, but one that has never really ended. And it's a story that illustrates, I believe, the ways that Islamophobia became a habitual feature of US military power and helped produce dynamics that still live with us in our contemporary world today. So with that in mind, let's jump back to 1898. That year, the United States invaded and conquered the Philippines, buying it from the declining Spanish Empire. While many of you may be familiar with the subsequent war between the American military and Philippine nationalist forces, a lesser-known series of conflicts also broke out in the archipelago's southern islands. These Muslim-majority spaces, home to groups collectively known as the Moros, there's a very complex history for that name that has to do with Spanish Empire, as I'm sure many of you will be familiar, had a long history of independence from the European colonial powers. Many Moros were uneasy about the arrival of the United States and the threats that this posed to their freedoms. Recognizing this, US colonial leaders quickly designated the region as one requiring indefinite military control. To justify this, they borrowed ideas about Islamic threat from other sites and agents of empire. Christian missionaries in the Middle East, for instance, army officers in British India, plantation owners in the Dutch East Indies, and others. By amplifying and exploiting fears of Islam, the US Army was able to govern the southern Philippines exclusively for 15 years. This military rule, maybe unsurprisingly, was marked by extreme violence. US Army officers trained to fight Native Americans on the western frontier redeployed to the Philippines. There, they directed combat against the Moros, whom they compared to Apache and Navajo warriors. These military men inherited derogatory stereotypes about Moro suicide attackers from Spanish texts and used them to rationalize brutal campaigns that killed hundreds of civilians. Colonial counterinsurgency in the Philippines included many familiar features. For instance, a type of torture known as the water cure, which was a precursor to waterboarding, crop burning and livestock destruction, the forced relocation of civilians to concentration zones where epidemic disease was rampant, the ritual desecration of slain Moros who were buried with the carcasses of pigs, and also outright massacres. The worst of these massacres occurred in the crater at the summit of Budaho, an extinct volcano on the island of Jolo. There, US forces killed between 900 and 1,000 Tausug Moro men, women, and children, posing for photographs with the dead afterwards. The army leadership then attempted to cover up the massacre, and when that failed, claimed that the Islamic faith, quote, made it necessary to fire, end quote. The US military left the Moro homelands for the first time in 1914, and the region faded from view in the United States, but it never fully vanished. American servicemen, for instance, in the 1930s, produced memoirs bragging of their violent mastery of the Moros. In the 50s, the Army printed posters celebrating another famous massacre in the region, this one led by John Pershing, then perhaps America's most famous general, or one of them. As the conflict in Vietnam escalated in the 1960s, military strategists looked to lessons of the so-called Moro War to fight the Viet Cong. And in the 70s and 80s, America lent the Marcos regime in the Philippines support in its dirty war against Moro separatists. Over a century's worth of Islamophobic knowledge produced in the southern Philippines surfaced more dramatically after September the 11th, 2001. In America, widely circulated chain emails demanded the United States fight terrorism in the greater Middle East using the Philippines' Muslim South as a template. These were not ignored. During the run-up to the war in Afghanistan, researchers from the Pentagon retrieved archival collections on the Philippines from the Library of Congress and the National Archives, searching 100-year-old documents for insights. The American experience colonizing the Moros, they hoped, would expedite the conquest and transformation of Afghanistan and Iraq. During this period, the Muslim regions of the Philippines were not only mined for their history, but also actively folded into the ever-expanding global war on terror as a component of Operation Enduring Freedom. Between 2001 and 2014, U.S. military advisors, drawn largely from special forces units, were stationed in the region, sometimes numbering as many as 600. The long-standing Moro independence movement, which in various forms stretched back centuries, was again folded into narratives of Muslim threat. In the early 2000s, even legitimate long-standing demands for autonomy were used as evidence of terrorism in the American imperial mindset. Most recently, in 2016 and 2017, and perhaps some of you will recall this, although the Trump era has given us so much material to think about that one thing has been inevitably replaced by another very quickly. A celebration of historical imperial violence against Moros appeared in the tweets and presidential campaign speeches of Donald J. Trump, who argued that the summary execution of Moro prisoners during the colonial era should serve as a model in America's current wars. His inflammatory words briefly captured the attention of American journalists and historians who argued over their historical accuracy and what U.S. colonialism in the Philippines told us about today. But lost in these discussions was the contemporary southern Philippines. The region is not only a site of historical inspiration for present-day empire builders, although as I hope I've made clear, it is certainly that as well, but is also home to ongoing conflict shaped by U.S. military involvement. In the past 20 years, it has been common to hear the term forever wars, particularly used by journalists, applied to American incursions into the Middle East and Central Asia, but I'd argue this term could be more productively applied to Southeast Asia, and specifically to this often overlooked part of the Philippines, where successive invasions and occupations have been framed within the prism of an eternal struggle with Islam. I'd like to end by briefly thinking about something that happened earlier this year. So in early February 2023, as a movie about Holo and the Sulu archipelago called Plane, starring Gerard Butler, was in theaters, trafficking in many of these tropes I've talked about, the U.S. Secretary of Defense Lloyd J. Austin III traveled to the Philippine island of Mindanao, the one-time home of the U.S. Army during its colonial rule of the Moros in the early 20th century. He was there to renew a military compact with his allies in the Philippine Armed Forces, and he praised their partnership through the language of global counterterrorism. He said to his Filipino counterpart, General Andres Centino, quote, "The kind of work that you've been doing down here for a very long time is absolutely extraordinary," end quote. It was unclear just how long Austin meant when he said a very long time. But within his words were histories of American empire and Islamophobia that stretched from the closing years of the 19th century to our present global moment. Thank you.
Thank you, Abdullah Al-Aryan, for the invitation. It's great to be back in Doha, especially at the Four Seasons. Abdullah asked me to be on this panel to reflect on the broad theme of Islamophobia and empire. And so I want to provide some just broad, generalized observations about the relationship between Islam, Islamophobia, and empire. And then I want to end with some controversial remarks that I hope won't get Abdullah in trouble, but we're under the auspices of Georgetown University, where we value academic freedom, so I'm going to maximize that opportunity to its full extent. So bigotry is deeply connected to empire. It's embedded in the very DNA of the colonial and imperial project and the attempt to subjugate and control people, particularly of a different culture and religious background. These truths are well known, they've been extensively documented. They also apply to the control of Muslim societies by European powers during the heyday of European colonialism, where anti-Muslim prejudice and bias was a significant part of the imperial project. No one seriously doubts this relationship between bigotry and empire. In the case of the Muslim world, the relationship between Islamophobia and empire is not straightforward and unidirectional. It would be a distortion of the historical and factual record to argue that European empires were motivated by and practiced and displayed one form of naked, unadulterated, and open anti-Muslim prejudice, and there's nothing more to know on the topic. While that approach might be intellectually soothing to some people, I think it is factually wrong, and it doesn't help us understand this topic. The relationship between empire and Islam was more complicated, and distinctions must be made if we seek an objective understanding of this topic. To better understand this topic, recall that the imperial conquest of much of the global south, in this case the Muslim world, was primarily a secular project. It was motivated by the material and economic needs and desires of imperial forces to expand their power. This manifested itself in the desire to gain control over the natural resources, land, and wealth of other societies, and to deny these societies self-determination and to prevent rival empires from getting there first. In short, empire was about politics, economics, and geography. It was not primarily about religion. If religion could be used to enhance the imperial project, then religion, religious leaders, and religious communities could be supported by imperial powers in various ways. When religion, or more accurately, certain manifestations of religion, posed an obstacle to the goal of imperial forces, then these manifestations of religion had to be opposed and crushed if necessary. In this latter context, Islamophobic tropes, discourses, and ideas were utilized to accomplish this goal. In David Motadel's wonderfully edited book, Islam and European Empires, he reminds us that during the height of British, French, Russian, and the Netherlands Empire, each of these European empires governed more Muslim subjects than any independent Muslim state. A long historical experience and documentary record has been left behind that helps us understand this topic with some objectivity and accuracy. What emerges in looking at the legacy of European empires and their control over Muslim societies is that there was actually a two-pronged approach that was adopted by colonial and imperial officials toward Muslim societies that they controlled. On the one hand, European officials from the outset realized the political significance of Islam and were very cautious when it came to interfering in the religious lives of their subjects. Governing the religious affairs of Muslims became central to imperial rule. In the colonies, European authorities regularly employed religious leaders and Islamic institutions to enhance social and political control. At the same time, their empires were increasingly challenged by religious resistant movements and Islamic insurgencies. Toward the end of the 19th century, government corridors in London, Paris, and St. Petersburg were haunted by the specter of pan-Islamism, a transnational, proto-nationalist effort by Muslims to expel Europeans from Muslim lands. Thus, imperial and colonial projects that came to the Muslim world were not openly and inherently Islamophobic and anti-Muslim. The problem was not Islam per se, but really those forms of Islamic expression that were political in nature, proto-nationalist in orientation, and which posed a threat to the imperial project. Compliant, apolitical, and submissive versions of Islam were perfectly acceptable and compatible with the goals of European empire and conquest. In fact, the documentary record shows that these forms of Islam received significant support by colonial and imperial powers because they helped advance the regulation and control of Muslim societies. This general relationship and attitude toward Islam and Muslim societies continued after political independence. With the withdrawal of European empires from Muslim societies and the creation of nominally independent new Muslim states, this general equation was kept in place, and it continues right up till the present. And so that's really my broad argument. So if you look back on the historical record, just to cite one example, when Napoleon Bonaparte invades and occupies Egypt in 1798, he publishes a proclamation in Arabic where he portrays himself as a friend of the local population and an ally against the Mamluks, the former slaves who ruled Egypt on behalf of Constantinople. Quote, "People of Egypt, they have told you that I have come to destroy your religion. But do not believe it. On the contrary, I come to restore your rights and punish the usurpers, since I respect Allah, His Prophet, and the Quran more than the Mamluks," the proclamation that Napoleon published proclaimed. After defeating the Mamluks, Bonaparte settles in Cairo, where he organized not one, but 2 birthday celebrations for the Prophet Muhammad. French officials decided to administer Egypt using Islamic judicial systems and structures, and they often employed Muslim religious leaders. Proclamations were translated into Arabic. Quranic interpretations were promoted to justify the French occupation of Egypt. In other parts of the French Empire, similar policies were pursued, deploying Islam to support colonial and imperial rule. But of course, with occupation comes resistance. And the most famous case of resistance to French colonial occupation of the Muslim world was in Algeria, when immediately after the French occupy Algeria in 1830, there was a significant resistance led by the Emir Abdel Qadir that lasted several decades until he's defeated. And if you look at the French depictions of the resistance to French colonization, particularly in this very famous essay by a prominent liberal intellectual, a very important person in the context of contemporary American politics and history, Alexis de Tocqueville, who writes Democracy on America. He was briefly the French foreign minister. He's quoted extensively in the United States. Alexis de Tocqueville spends a lot of time in Algeria and writes an essay on Algeria, where he depicts the Algerians as semi-barbaric. He draws upon a clash of civilizations narrative to portray Muslims, particularly the Emir Abdel Qadir, as fundamentally sort of resistant to the type of modernization and civilization that the French want to bring to the Algerians. But after that resistance is crushed, you see the French using official Islam, funding it, supporting it, particularly a dense network of imams, muftis, and other charities are used by the French as a tool for strategic domination. And similar and identical policies were adopted by the French in the protectorates of Morocco and Tunisia. British policies toward Muslims during the heyday of the British Empire were less interventionist and regulatory than the French, but they often followed a very similar sort of narrative. There was support for an official version of Islam, for Islamic leaders, for Islamic institutions, for Islamic judicial structures, particularly those Muslims that were loyal to the imperial project. They received support. The Hajj pilgrimage was very much part of the imperial project. Realizing that Muslims had to go to Hajj, you had colonial empires that would facilitate these types of pilgrimages. But if you look at the documentary record, what emerges in all of these European empires is a deep fear that these Muslims who go to Hajj might come back with these radical ideas of revolt and revolution rooted in pan-Islam. This is something that comes across in all of the writings about Muslims, empire, this idea that, look, there are these certain manifestations of Islam that we have to be very careful of, because if we're not careful, they're going to come back to haunt us. And this is where you start to see the Islamophobic tropes and attitudes. And this basic two-prong approach that I'm describing actually continues in the post-independent period. So when these new independent Muslim states emerge, you see a lot of Western support and admiration for the official versions of Islam in the pro-Western monarchies in Jordan, in Morocco, in Iran under the Shah, and then a growing sort of anxiety when there is, over the 20th century, a more independent form of Islam that emerges from within civil society, that is religious nationalist in orientation, that is calling for a change in the political status quo, that is demanding democratization. That's where the problem comes in. And it's that form of political Islam that starts to become a problem, and that's where you start to see the Islamophobic tropes. So the last part of sort of my talk here that I wanted to sort of just mention is this idea of a particular form of Islam that starts to promote Islamophobia in the West is now taking on a new manifestation because we have this new situation that really hasn't been documented and studied closely by people in Islamic phobia studies. And that is how we have a situation where Arab autocratic regimes have emerged as key proponents of Islamophobia in the West. Several of these Mideast governments have formed alliances with right-wing groups in the West dedicated to anti-Muslim bigotry. There's a convergence of interests by these different constituencies, one located in the Middle East, another located in the West, who are fueling Islamophobia for different reasons. But the net result is that innocent Muslims in the West are paying a price for this coordinated policy of moral malfeasance. And a lot of this really takes shape after the Arab Spring, when there's a deep fear that political Islam is going to come to power as Arab authoritarianism starts to weaken. And you have these authoritarian regimes, primarily the United Arab Emirates, but also Saudi Arabia and the Sisi regime in Egypt, who are petrified when Mohammed Morsi comes to power and the Muslim Brotherhood start playing a prominent role in Egypt and in Tunisia. And what you see is that these autocratic authoritarian regimes go to Western capitals and says, we don't like the fact that there are these sympathizers of the Muslim Brotherhood who are living in your cities and they're promoting revolution, they're promoting political change. We want you to crack down on these people. And if you don't, there's going to be financial consequences. The Guardian published a very important piece around this time where it actually showed that the United Arab Emirates went to the David Cameron government and said, we want you to crack down on these people living in London who are promoting political change, supporting the Arab Spring, and if you don't, there's not going to be a renewal of these business contracts of arms sales. And the David Cameron government sort of panics. Of course, they can't do what the United Arab Emirates wants, but they do something that sort of satisfies the Emiratis in the end. They establish this commission to investigate the role of the Muslim Brotherhood in England. And in 2015, the Cameron government publishes an official report on the role of the Muslim Brotherhood in the United Kingdom to satisfy the Emiratis. And the report is somewhat ambiguous, but it gives the Emiratis enough to be happy with, saying that, yeah, there is this sort of unexamined, ongoing relationship between the Muslim Brotherhood and extremism. We have to sort of watch it. We have to be careful. And so this is where sort of, I think, the root of this convergence between the role of these autocratic regimes and the West starts to take place, and you start to see a convergence where the Emiratis in particular start to spend a lot of money in trying to target, promote hysteria, and undermine the presence of Muslims living in the West, particularly those Muslims who have ties to the Muslim Brotherhood movement. And you see a convergence of interest here between these two different constituencies. It's not a coincidence, for example, that just last week, the figure of Tucker Carlson himself, who's a mainstream voice of American fascism, he was on Fox News, gives an interview where he's asked, which world leader does he admire the most? And he says, Mohammed bin Zayed of the United Arab Emirates, who Tucker Carlson calls the wisest and most interesting leader he has ever met. And so this is a new sort of problem with respect to the question of Islamophobia, the role of Arab autocratic governments, particularly the ones that have a lot of economic resources, fueling Islamophobia, targeting groups like CARE in the United States, targeting congresswomen like Ilhan Omar, and feeding into existing Islamophobic sort of tropes and themes and constituencies that already have a position in the West, raising the level of Islamophobia to new levels because of this convergence of interest. Now, this is, I think, as I said, a new topic that I think needs to be investigated and studied at a much deeper level. There's been a lot of good reporting on it. There's been a few conference papers, but there's been no systematic study of this new phenomenon of Islamophobia that really falls under the banner of this panel, the question of empire and Islamophobia. Thank you.
Assalamu alaikum. Thank you so much to the organizers for inviting me to speak today. So I wanted to start my talk by sharing a quote from a prominent Indian leader of the 20th century, and I quote, "The Muslims who came to India from outside brought no new technique or political and economic structure. In spite of a religious belief in the Brotherhood of Islam, they were class-bound and feudal in outlook. In technique and in the methods of production and industrial organization, they were inferior to what prevailed then in India. Thus, their influence on the economic life of India and the social structure was very little. You might be wondering who would have glossed over nearly 7 centuries of Muslim rule in the subcontinent as having had nothing to offer to its economic or political life. Perhaps it was V.D. Savarkar, one of the primary ideologues of Hindutva, who sought to define India in exclusively Hindu terms. Or perhaps it was M.S. Golwalkar, who was a prominent leader in the RSS, the Hindu nationalist paramilitary organization. No. The Indian leader with the disparaging remarks towards Muslims was none other than Jawaharlal Nehru, the head of the Indian National Congress at the height of the anti-colonial movement against the British, the first Prime Minister of independent India, lauded for standing up against the communal politics of his time and defending Indian secularism. However, in many of his writings, Nehru appears to have much in common with the Hindu nationalists that he abhorred, not least because of his reference to Muslims as coming to India from outside, as well as his territorial ideas of a unified Indian civilization. These ideas played a huge role in Nehru and the Indian government's colonization of Kashmir in the aftermath of partition, as discourses of Kashmir being integral to Hindu or Indian civilization because of its Hindu history and Sanskrit literary tradition, to the exclusion of its Muslim histories, were present in both Hindu and secular nationalist justification for Kashmir's forcible incorporation into the modern Indian nation-state. In anti-Hindutva advocacy and scholarship efforts today, you'll often hear that India's once pluralist or once secular past is being threatened by the Islamophobia of India's current Hindu nationalist political dispensation under Prime Minister Modi of the BJP. This perspective whitewashes the histories of state violence and bigotry against Muslims, Sikhs, Christians, Dalits, and Adivasis or tribal communities. Much of the violence of Indian secular nationalism espoused by leaders such as Nehru is often overlooked. It's important to look at the deeper histories that animate the rampant Islamophobia in India today and challenge the notion that Indian secular and Hindu nationalism are oppositional, and examine the ways in which the two actually interact with one another and draw from one another. This allows us to think more critically about how both rely on majoritarian logics that end up reinforcing existing power dynamics and forms of exclusion, or in the case of Kashmir, forcible inclusion. Indian secular nationalism seeks to mediate Muslim identities, emphasizing a syncretic, depoliticized, not really so Muslim identity for the subcontinent. Hindu nationalism is more exclusive in how it views the place of Muslims in India as being subordinate to India's Hindu identity. Yet the same ideas about Muslim indigeneity, self-determination, and solidarity, as well as India's essential character as Hindu, animate both ideologies. And so, while the rise of right-wing Hindu nationalism in India has contributed to increasing violence against both Indian Muslims and Kashmiri Muslims, it's important to historicize how the essential character of Indian nationalism, as well as the Indian nation-state, is Hindu majoritarian and Islamophobic. For the remainder of my time, I want to focus on how one of the main ways Islamophobia has operated throughout history is through a denial of Muslim indigeneity, or a sense of Muslim belonging to a place. Modern nations like India regulate Muslimness, referring to earlier panel today, through negating or erasing Muslim indigeneity, utilizing presentist logics of territoriality and notions of religious and ethnic identities. Islamophobic discourses often rely on positioning Muslim empires and peoples as lacking indigeneity to any particular region, whether it's the subcontinent, Persia, Palestine, or Africa. Muslims can only ever be invaders or outsiders, and the pre-Islamic past is the only authentic indigenous one. Yet, many of the contemporary nation-states that Muslims are deemed as invaders to have not been cohesive, unified political entities historically. Moreover, they have been subject to multiple groups of people coming and going, including the very groups that these discourses deem indigenous. Thus, such narratives in their constructions of places and peoples are ahistoric and obscure the arbitrariness of identifying insiders and outsiders, as well as points of historic origin. Muslim constructions of Muslimness also deny indigeneity and valorize migrant Muslim geographies. In addition, the transnational character of many Muslims, as well as their attempts to show solidarity beyond national borders, further reinforces anxieties about Muslim indigeneity. In the subcontinent, Islamophobic discourses that denied Muslim indigeneity emerged during the British colonial period in the 18th century. In order to legitimize their rule, British officials portrayed the subcontinent's previous rulers, the Mughals, as Oriental despots ruling tyrannically over a majority Hindu population. Muslims were also painted as being foreign invaders and the Hindus submissive during their rule. This is also interesting because many argue that the British, when they arrived on the subcontinent, actually created the category of Hinduism as a religious category. But nonetheless, the British presented themselves as bringing back the ancient Hindu or Indian civilization that existed before the Muslim conquests, essentially white men saving Hindus from the despotic Muslims. In developing their understandings of the subcontinent's past and present, they worked primarily with upper caste Hindus or Brahmins, who encouraged the British to view the Brahmins as the predominant group in Indian society. Over time, both Hindu nationalists and secular nationalists internalized these discourses of Muslim despotism, foreignness, and communal conquests. So this is where you can get a sense of where Nehru's comments are coming from. In the Muslim-majority region of Kashmir, both the British state and a small minority of upper caste Kashmiri Brahmins, known as Pandits, promoted an exclusively Hindu history of Kashmir, to which Islam was a latter-day interloper. Hindu mythological texts in Sanskrit were passed off as authentic representations of Kashmir's history, while centuries of Muslim intellectual and cultural production in Arabic, Persian, and Urdu was erased and ignored. Hindus were described as being indigenous to the land, and Muslims were not, even as most Kashmiri Muslims were converts from lower caste communities seeking to escape the Brahmanical caste system. In the post-independence period then, both Hindu and secular nationalists adopted these ideas of Kashmir's centrality to Hindu civilization to argue that Kashmir was naturally to be incorporated into the new Indian state. Kashmir is a unique space that highlights the confluence of multiple cultural influences. For as much as Kashmir was a part of the Sanskrit world, it was also a part of the Persianate world. Yet it would be difficult to make a claim today that Kashmir is integral to the Iranian nation-state. Yet this is precisely the logic that the Indian state has used, erasing other ties, histories, and networks in its construction of a past and naturalizing Brahmanical territorial imaginaries. Now, what's interesting about this story is that when it came to India's international stance on Kashmir after partition, Nehru and the Indian nationalist leadership highlighted Kashmir's Muslim majority status in multiple speeches and letters, including at the UN. Nehru craftily deployed Kashmir's Muslim majority status to bolster India's claim as a tolerant secular state, especially in comparison to its rival, Pakistan. The Indian National Congress presented Pakistan as an Islamic, theocratic, communal state, and India as the democratic, secular republic to the international community. For Indian nationalists, holding on to Kashmir, a Muslim-majority region, would signal the failure of the idea of Pakistan, as well as the logic behind the two-nation theory upon which Muhammad Ali Jinnah based his demand for Muslim sovereignty. Thus, India's nationalist leadership claimed India on account of their belief in its inherent Hindu history and identity, while simultaneously deploying its Muslim-majority status to assert their secularity for the international community. The reason why this history is so important today is that it is precisely this denial of Muslim indigeneity that enables Indian settler colonization of Kashmir, as well as legal and political attempts to completely marginalize Indian Muslims. In Kashmir, the narrative of exclusive Hindu belonging or indigeneity to the land means that Muslims simply do not belong and can be replaced by settling Hindus into Kashmir so that Kashmiri Muslims and their demands for sovereignty can be dealt with once and for all. Across India, questions about Muslim belonging arise, including in places like Assam, where migrations of Bengali Muslims into Assam before the borders of the nation-state were formed have now made them vulnerable to immense harassment, violence, as well as losing their citizenship. What is also important to note is that discourses of rejecting Muslim indigeneity has been a tactic used not just by Indian secular or Hindu nationalists to reject Kashmiri demands for sovereignty or Muslim belonging in India, but also by Zionists in their settler colonization of Palestine. Understanding longer histories of Islamophobia will thus have to engage with questions of indigeneity and how it can often play into these colonizing projects. Yet in today's world, indigeneity is also an important category from which to leverage decolonial demands for self-determination or sovereignty, especially in settler colonial contexts. So I would like to end with some questions. Maybe we can discuss them during the Q&A. Thinking about how indigeneity in the context of Islamophobia can be deployed and to what end. And also another question about whether asserting or proving your indigeneity or belonging to a space is actually even the answer. One of the contexts that I think about is in the United States, how a lot of American Muslims will say, well, you know, we have always been here. Well, we have always been here as settlers to a certain extent. But does it also mean that just because we have always been here, that's the only reason that you shouldn't treat us poorly, right? So with Indian Muslims or with Kashmiri Muslims, why should they have to prove their belongingness or indigeneity to make sure that they do not get ethnically cleansed or have to be subjected to a genocide? So just some questions to think about. Thank you.
Thank you to the organizers for inviting me and for putting together such a well-attended conference. And if I may just quickly add one quick point to your excellent presentation, I think that the question of self-determination for Kashmiris is fraught not just in terms of, you know, the Hindu right and secularists, but even on the left, right? As you mentioned, for Nehru, holding on to Kashmir was a sign of India's secularism. And a quick anecdote, which is that some of us at the World Social Forum in Bombay/Mumbai in 2004 put together a panel called End the Occupation, Iraq, Palestine, Kashmir. And the World Social Forum, for people who don't know, is, you know, a movement from below. It is in opposition to the World Economic Forum, which goes on in Davos and so on. But we were told that we should organize security because there were people potentially going to come and beat us up for yoking Kashmir together with Palestine and with Iraq. So this is a very fraught question, and I'm really happy that it got mentioned at this conference and so beautifully. Okay. So what am I going to talk about? Now, when I was asked to speak about Islamophobia and empire, I will confess that I have not just spilt inkwells of ink, but buckets of ink writing about this topic, hundreds and hundreds of pages. And so what to say in 8 to 10 minutes that would actually be useful to an audience that is not simply academics, but also students, people from the community, and others who are trying to grapple with this not just as an intellectual issue, but as a lived experience, right? And so what I thought I would do is not repeat anything that was already said, first of all, and second, pick up on a question that was raised in the previous panel, which is, can the speakers speak to the pre-Enlightenment, that is the pre-16th, 17th century intellectual movement known as the Enlightenment, the pre-Enlightenment origins of Islamophobia? And I want to answer that question in 2 parts. In the first part, I want to push back against the idea that Islamophobia goes back all the way to the beginning of Islam. That was also something that came up this morning. Or to the Crusades or the Reconquista, because I think there's something very problematic about comparing racism that exists in the current moment to attitudes that were prevalent over a millennium ago. And I'll explain why this is important, because there's a whole body of work that is actually arguing that racism goes back to medieval Europe, in fact, goes back to antiquity and Aristotle's defense of slavery and so forth. And I think that's problematic for a number of reasons. So that's one part of the way in which I'm going to address this question. And second, I'd like to go back a little further than the 18th and 17th century and talk about Spain in the 16th century, which is where many people, including myself, have argued that the idea of Muslims as a race tied to blood purity laws actually comes into being, alongside, of course, the idea of Jews as being as a separate race, again, tied to blood purity comes into being. But I think fundamentally, and maybe in some ways I'm anticipating what's going to be said in the next panel, the question for us is, how do we define Islamophobia? And there is now something called Islamophobia studies. I never thought I was part of Islamophobia studies, but apparently I am. It's a field that sort of burgeoned in the 2010s. Prior to 9/11, there was no such field, but now it's quite big. And there is a subsection of us, including some who are speaking on the next panel, who've argued that Islamophobia is not simply prejudice, it is not simply bigotry, it's not simply religious intolerance or xenophobia or ethnocentrism, but in fact it is anti-Muslim racism, in the sense that it is a body of ideas as seen in prejudice, bigotry, and so on and so forth, but it's also baked into a social structure, into a society, in a way that makes the oppression and discrimination of people normal, accepted, right? So, for instance, in the United States, it is not just that we have Hollywood films that depict Muslims as violent fanatics bent on terrorism and so on and so forth. It is also the case that, for instance, the FBI operates on the assumption that Muslims are guilty until proven innocent. So if you think of the logic of mass surveillance programs, right, where the FBI, the New York Police Department, and so on have infiltrated mosques, even kindergartens, right, shops, and so forth, to collect systematically information about Muslims, including schools, my school as well, right? Why? What is the logic there? The logic is that Muslims produce radicals who turn to violence, and therefore we need to preempt this by surveilling them. Now, you talk to an FBI agent, and they will say, I'm not racist, I'm just doing what is smart security policy. I'm trying to stop something violent from happening before it actually happens. And then you push that a little further and you say, okay, so in the United States, there is far more violence attributed to white supremacists, neo-Nazis, and so forth. Why isn't there an analogous system of surveillance of white communities? And people are shocked, right? I don't know why I'm invited to give speeches before FBI agents and CIA agents, but the Center for Terrorism, John Jay University, will invite me to speak from time to time. So I do get to engage with these folks. And of course, they don't have an answer, because for them, whites are unique individuals. There's no question of surveilling white communities. And so it's in that sense that someone does not have to think of themselves as racist, but systematic policies like mass surveillance are racist, right? So if that's our definition, and indeed this is an important definition, because if we're going to put an end to the racism that Muslims face, we need to understand where it's coming from, and it's coming from the bowels of the national security state. It's coming from the bowels of empire. All right, so then I go back to the first part of how I'm going to answer this question of the pre-Enlightenment origins of Islamophobia. There is now a whole body of work that says that race and racism go back millennia. Why is that a problem? Well, first and foremost, it is true that in the context of the Crusades, in the context of the Reconquista, right, that's the term given to the attempt by northern Spanish rulers to retake Al-Andalus, which was under Muslim rule for 800 years, bloody wars of conquest. Of course, there were horribly negative ideas about Islam, about the Prophet Muhammad, about Muslims. People have written really well about this. But the fact of the matter is that these negative attitudes coexisted also with admiration, with great praise for people like Salahuddin, right? For the Prophet himself and the role that he played as a political leader and so forth. So there were very contradictory notions. But fundamentally, I think, if you look at medieval Europe, it consisted of a system known as parcelized sovereignty, where there weren't powerful empires, right? Europe was a backstage compared to other powerful Chinese and Muslim and other empires on the global stage. They could not institute on a structural level the kind of discrimination that we call racism, right? It's like saying in Afghanistan there are anti-American attitudes, but that does not mean that there's anti-American racism, because Afghanistan cannot do to the United States what the United States has done to Afghanistan. So to go back to Ambassador Rasool's talk this morning about power, racism is about that kind of power, and it is therefore essential and necessary to tie Islamophobia, in my opinion, to power structures in that way. Okay, the second part of what I want to reflect on briefly. So racism and race is a modern phenomenon. It's an early modern phenomenon. And in 16th century Spain, when Ferdinand and Isabella finally get rid of the Muslims, 1492, they give both Muslims and Jews a choice: either convert or we're going to expel you. And indeed, you see the mass expulsion of Jews in 1492. This does not affect Muslims to quite the same extent at that point, because as historians have written, rich Muslims had by that point emigrated. Those who remained were agricultural workers, and their work and their produce was essential to the functioning of Spanish society, so they were not targeted as much. However, when it comes to Jews, Jewish people actually were professionals. Ferdinand himself had Jewish relatives, right? One of the monarchs, Ferdinand and Isabella and so on. And what you see in this context is that the old Christians, that is people who are not converts, are very keen to get the jobs that Jewish people have, right? Professional jobs, to go off to the new world and get the loot and so forth. And so they are the drivers behind blood purity laws, limpieza de sangre, right? And that's how it spreads across Spain, because these old Christians want the status, want the wealth and so on that come with it, right? And so that's when Christian universalism, which is the idea that if you convert to Christianity, your otherness is immediately gone and you're accepted into the Christian fold, that's the hard end of Christian universalism. In the Middle Ages, anyone who lived outside the known world was seen as a monster, right? And there were monsters all over the place. But if you converted, great, you are accepted. So even in the context of the Crusades, for instance, there's the genre of French poetry known as the chansons de geste, where you have all sorts of negative constructions of Muslims, but then you have these Muslim rulers who are the equivalent of French knights and who are respected. And the story arc usually went this way, where the Muslim ruler was going to be defeated, but he's so brave and so fantastic. But if he converts, fine, we will not kill him, we will accept him, we will sing his praises and so forth. So all this is to say, in line with what the previous speaker said, there are very contradictory notions that coexist. And if we flatten history and do not see these contradictions, then what happens is we have what academics call an essentialist view of not just race, but of history. And when we see racism as existing through all history, then there's really no point in fighting it today, because what we're saying is it will exist for all time. And that is, frankly, a very demoralizing perspective. So people like myself who've not just written and researched and studied about this topic, but have also spent time fighting against anti-Muslim racism, it's important for us to have historically grounded understandings so that we may effectively resist and put an end to Islamophobia. Thanks.
Thank you all for those amazing presentations, which I'm sure are going to generate a lot of questions from the audience. But I'm going to begin with a few questions for all of you. I'll begin with Ali. You've discussed these historical links between the US military treatment of Filipino Muslims in the past, and then how President Trump brings this up during his presidential campaigns. But can you expand a little bit on your comments about Filipino Muslims and their relationship with the United States today? So I'm curious what the shards of empire, what Ann Norton talked about, the shards of empire, how they have impacted that relationship today.
Right. So, I mean, in the early 2000s, the Pentagon commissioned a report from the Rand Corporation, which is this sort of state-aligned think tank, basically asking them, as was the want of the United States at the time, to kind of diagnose issues within Muslim societies the world over and produce this multi-hundred-page report. And this is a document that has been reflected upon and studied at great length by scholars looking at the U.S. involvement, especially in the Middle East in the last 20 years. But the Philippines appear in this as well. And this report talks about issues between what would have become Filipino Muslims, but are groups that traditionally didn't understand themselves as Filipino, certainly not Christian Filipino, going back to the Cold War, but it doesn't really think about kind of the colonial roots of this, both in the Spanish and American periods. And what this document is used for is to mobilize the U.S. security apparatus to include the Philippines within the global war on terror, right? And this acts as kind of a legitimating, or one of several legitimating mechanisms to expand the U.S. military presence there. The U.S. military presence never left the Philippines. It's a key site for the sort of, it's a forward projection base for U.S. military power in the Asia Pacific. But it leads to this sort of reinvigoration of the American military presence in places like Zamboanga on the island of Mindanao. And so really, in the last 20 years or so, we have two stories going on. We have one, which is this kind of militarized relationship between the United States and the Philippine government that is ongoing and as I mentioned, sort of continues to exist today. And then kind of relatedly, you have these kind of manifestations of Filipino Muslim groups, the sort of Moro is the collective term that they now use as well, in the kind of U.S. popular imagination. So the sort of ideas that are able to be capitalized on and exploited by sort of right-wing populists like Trump, but many others as well.
So Nader, I kept waiting for the controversial part to come up because I was going to make Abdullah come and deal with it. But then I realized for me, like, nothing was controversial. Maybe that's because you're in Qatar, not in the UAE, and we were on the receiving end of that. So let me shift to something else, which might be controversial. So I'm going to quote Edward Said. He said, quote, "Every single empire in its official discourse has said that it's not like all the others. that its circumstances are special, that it has a mission to enlighten, civilize, bring order and democracy, and that it uses force only as a last resort. And then he goes on to kind of challenge that, right? But let me challenge Saeed, may he rest in peace, to ask you, when we think about the relationship between Islamophobia and empire for the United States, has the United States been exceptional in comparison to European empires?
Yeah, no, I think that was the point that I was trying to make. There's been a continuity in terms of the modern manifestations of empire. The United States is an empire that does adopt a very two-pronged approach to the question of Islam that I think has its origins in the European empires that emerge in the 18th and 19th century in the Muslim world. In other words, today in the United States has never had a problem with the Islam of the House of Saud in Saudi Arabia, for example, or the Islam of the Hashemite Kingdom of Jordan, or in Morocco, or as I said, under the Shah of Iran. That Islam is perfectly fine because it's an Islam that is viewed as completely compatible with the needs and the demands and the desires of contemporary empires, right? The problem emerges is that when you have these, what I call religious nationalist expressions of Islam that come from society and that have a democratic orientation and start to challenge the status quo. And they start to sort of demand political change and challenge the interests of empire, as we saw in 1979 in Iran, as we saw during the Arab Spring. Then you have a panic set in. Wait a second. We like the old Islam, the apolitical Islam, the Islam that is compatible with our interests, largely economic interests and strategic interests. We don't like the version of Islam that is anti-status quo, that is revolutionary, that has democratic aspirations. And so, in many ways, the empire that we see right now in the United States, and we can even see how, for example, the Obama administration, which is, compared to other American administrations, the most, at least rhetorically, most progressive, supported the Arab Spring. Whenever there was an opportunity for Obama to really take a stand in support of the democratic ideals that the United States claims it supports, in the context of Egypt, it completely sort of shifted and bent in the direction of General al-Sisi and the counter-revolution, and all the evidence that we have from members of the Obama administration who were there at the time is that this fear, this idea that, look, Islam is just not compatible with democracy. Of course Mohammed Morsi is going to screw up because he's a Muslim Brotherhood person and he draws his inspiration from Islam. There's been some documentation that has come out, and that view, that attitude was very much part and parcel of contemporary empires. The United States in particular, its attitude toward the Muslim world, and it continues unabated. So I think, to understand empire today and its attitude toward Islam, if one goes back to the heyday of European empires, one can see where the origins of these attitudes were first located.
Thank you. So Hafsa, I want to go back to something, another thing Anne said in the panel about this kind of liberating space that came with the fall of empire. But of course, and I know Anne wouldn't disagree with this, you show that there's colonial power is of course still with us, right? Can you expand a little bit on that relationship between Islamophobia and colonial power and the ways in which we still see these shards of empire existing? And then I have a second question. You don't have to answer. I don't mean to put you on the spot. And Deepa also briefly mentioned this, because when you were speaking, I couldn't help thinking of the parallels between what India is doing, using history as a weapon, right, with what's happening or has happened in Israel, right? So can you talk a little bit, if you want, about how you see those as similar, or if you see those as similar?
So in terms of colonialism, or kind of these contemporary forms of colonialism, I actually don't think the decolonial moment in much of the world was that liberatory. And the ways that some people, of course it had liberatory potential, but a lot of these third world nationalists or anti-colonial leaders ended up not just adopting a lot of the logics and the methods of their former colonial powers, but they also expanded on them in different ways too. So a country like India, for example, is often lauded for its huge anti-colonial movement. Of course, everyone here has heard of Gandhi and the nonviolence and so on. And yet, when you actually look at the moment in which the Indian nation state is formed, it's done through immense violence, not just as a result of partition with the border with Pakistan, but also in Kashmir, of course, in Hyderabad, where there was an annexation, police action by Nehru in the northeast, and in so many other territories. And so part of what I think we often do is see colonialism as just emerging from Europe to the global south, but it's also important to contextualize colonialisms that are happening within the global south in this moment that the nation state is being formed. Because again, we assume that the nation state's territories are what they are. And that when a country like India goes into Kashmir or goes into Hyderabad or other places, that it's just doing nation building. But it's in fact acting like a colonial power and using different colonial techniques and expanding upon them in these regions. As for the second question, I mean, I think, yes, definitely the use of history and use of specifically religious mythology or religious stories in both cases with Zionism as well as Hindu nationalism there's definitely overlaps around those two. Of course, the Israel case is, there's also the context of the Holocaust that plays a role in that as well, which India doesn't necessarily have, although they do try to use the Kashmiri Pandit issue in Kashmir as a similar thing. So yeah, I think there's definitely these similarities in terms of the use of, or the weaponization of history.
So Deepa, our students at Georgetown, and many are in the audience, most of them will not go on to be academics, thank God, because there are no jobs, as I've told you repeatedly. But they are actually looking to make change. And I want to ask you as an academic, but also as an activist, how you see the role of academics and how you see, them, like what are the tools? What do they do, right? And how do they do it? And then the other question is, what are the challenges that academics face today when they try to be activists?
Okay, great. If I may, I'll just say something quickly about the previous questions as well, and then get to what you want me to talk about. I think Azad Issa's book is really good on the comparison between Zionism and Hindu nationalism and how they learn from one another. And the topic of Hinduphobia came up in the previous, in the morning panel. And I just want to say, as somebody who was born into a Hindu family, there is no such thing. I think we really have to dispense with this notion that a majoritarian community somehow faces racism or phobia or whatever by a minority community whose people are being lynched and who are being structurally discriminated is absolute nonsense. So I reject that term, Hinduphobia. I think it's a very opportunistic way in which Hindu nationalists have tried to push back against Indian intellectuals who argue against Islamophobia, right? It's a sort of, it's the weapon, just as Norman Finkelstein writes about the weaponization of anti-Semitism by certain sectors of the Zionist project, similarly, Hinduphobia has become a term that is used to try to silence critics of Hindu nationalism. Okay, very quickly to augment what Nader said about Said and Orientalism and so on. I mean, I think Said's point is, in Orientalism at least, is that whereas Britain and France had a good deal of direct experience in the Middle East, the US did not. And that's true. Its experience is in some ways through its connection to Israel, but it also learns intellectually from Orientalists moving across the Atlantic and taking positions in US universities, right? Not just Bernard Lewis, but H.A.R. Gibb and a whole bunch of others who bring those attitudes with them and are quite influential in foreign policy circles. At the same time, though, you also have modernization theorists, Daniel Lerner's Passing of Traditional Society, and so forth. And I did a comparative analysis between the two, and there's not much difference in terms of their attitudes towards people in South Asia and in West Asia and so forth. It was about how capitalism is going to uplift everyone, and those who resist are somehow backward and traditional and so forth. Never mind the destruction that these modernization programs were, wreaking around the world. Okay. Finally, to the question of academics, challenges, and activism. I can say, so let me speak to my own experience perhaps as a way to, maybe offer some thoughts to students who may not want to be academics because there aren't jobs. I think in some ways the privilege of being able to go to school, to get a bachelor's degree, to get a master's degree, to get an advanced PhD degree, this should be worth something, right? It shouldn't just be about the production of knowledge, although that is a good goal and aim in and of itself. It should be directed at, in some ways, changing the world, even if that means just organizing teach-ins, holding conferences, but ultimately, with organizing and being involved in practice or praxis, whatever you may want to say. And I don't think that's a sacrifice. I actually think that in my own experience, having one foot in the academy and one foot outside has been really, really helpful, because being part of movements has sharpened my ability to think about intellectual questions. What are people saying? What are some of the problems that movements are coming across? And how can I, as a tenured professor whose job it is to study, how can I answer some of those questions? And those ways of grappling on the ground with what to do has been very beneficial to my scholarship and vice versa. So there should be that relationship inside the academy and outside, and at least in the United States, and certainly with the Arab uprisings, students played a fantastically huge role, right? And the university has been that space where people are taught to think critically, and because they're taught to think critically, they challenge the status quo at the university, outside the university, and so forth. And nobody likes that, right? That is to say, the powers that be do not like this kind of resistance. And yet, this has been the space where this is possible. So challenges, well, you don't get tenure, you get blacklisted. If you are active particularly around Palestinian rights, you get onto, all sorts of hit lists, you may not get a job, and so on and so forth. And at the same time, if you look at, for instance, in the United States, all of the movements of the 1960s around anti-racism, around feminism, and so on, all of those actually changed that country for the better. And it would not have happened if people had not stood up and spoke out against empire, against racism, and so forth.
Speaking of these websites, I'm always sad that I'm still not on Canary Mission's website. I feel like it would be, I'm not. So if anybody is here from Canary Mission, please add my name. So I have a question. I'm going to go to the questions from the audience to Nader. Relating to Islamophobia in Muslim autocratic regimes, it seems like they are casting a very wide supposed extremist net. Is this intentional?
Well, what's intentional is targeting those manifestations of Islam that pose a threat to the security and stability of autocratic regimes. So the United Arab Emirates and the Sisi regime in Saudi Arabia, they go after those expressions of Islam that are political in nature, that are revolutionary, that are democratic, because it's those expressions of Islam that challenge the stranglehold of these autocratic regimes in their own societies. That's exactly what it's about. So if you look at what's happening today, the United Arab Emirates is very much in favor of promoting a form of ecumenical Islam that invites the Pope to Abu Dhabi, that gets along very well with leaders of the American Jewish community. But of course, it's a form of religion and a form of Islam that is fundamentally apolitical and doesn't challenge the status quo. So I think that's fundamentally what's going on. And of course, as I said in my remarks, what you have is that that's the motive coming out, that's the desire, that's the project coming out of these Arab autocratic regimes, and then overlaps with existing Islamophobic communities and tropes within Western societies that have their own agenda and have their own hatred of Muslims. And so that raises the political temperature, for example, in various Muslim societies in the West. To just take one example, some people know the academic who works on Islamophobia in Europe, Farid Hafez, an Austrian. He was basically targeted by this project. In fact, I would just give a plug for this really great article if you want to get a manifestation for how this actually works. Earlier this year in the New Yorker magazine, David Kirkpatrick wrote a wonderful piece called, if I get the title correct, I think The Politics of a Smear Campaign, where he looks at, and he does a lot of research, I spoke to him about it, he spent a year researching this, how the United Arab Emirates spends a lot of money trying to target people who have connections to the Muslim Brotherhood, completely upending their lives and targeting innocent Muslims who have nothing to do with the Muslim Brotherhood, but just happen to be sort of living their lives. They're involved in NGO work, relief work, and it's a fascinating article that just provides an important illustration for how toxic this type of policies are, backed by a lot of money, and then sort of linking up with these, Islamophobic narratives and individuals who are operating already in the West. That's I think, what's going on.
To Deepa, did empire play in baking this phenomenon in the social structure of societies, or is it the work of nation states?
Both, isn't it? It depends on the context, right? The absolutist Spanish state of Ferdinand and Isabella was a fundamentally Catholic state that could actually fuel the Reconquista through this very sort of Catholic Christian identity, and all others, of course, were taken up by the Inquisition and branded other and so forth. So absolutely, states have a huge role to play. There's a recent article in Historical Materialism where Satnam Verdi makes the argument that it took the rise of absolutist states before you could actually see racism. Because these smaller parcelized sovereignty, states didn't have quite the ability to institutionalize racism in quite that way. That said, Spain was, of course, one of the emerging and one of the huge empires in the era of mercantilism, right? The expansion to the New World and the encounter with people in the New World and so forth, and the ways in which Native Americans and the Moors were compared, right? So these ideas traveled across the Atlantic, as did policies, right? So the policies used during the process of reconquest are also used across the Atlantic. So empire is a state. A state can become an empire. In fact, I would argue that even India is a sub-imperial power in relation to other, countries around it. So, both.
This question is to Hafsa. How can we address the systemic changes in textbooks that perpetuate Islamophobic narratives by various groups, with a particular focus on the HSS within the 21st century empire?
Wow. I mean, I don't know if the answer is, I guess if the question is in India, I mean, the work has to happen from so much beyond just the textbooks. That's just one iteration of how this Islamophobia project in India is playing out. But what I think is really important actually is that Muslims and those who are Muslim adjacent or allies with Muslims need to really do the intellectual work to combat a lot of these discourses and the ways in which all of these discourses have just been naturalized into, it's just seen as history. So doing that research, even in the pre-modern period, not just the colonial period and the impacts of colonialism, but even looking before that, understanding how Muslim empires like the Mughals, like the Ottomans, etc. There's of course a lot of work on the Ottomans, but I think there needs to be a lot more work on pre-colonial South Asia that needs to happen. But you know, even then, there's so many material ties and ideological ties that no matter how many books you write that contest these narratives, it still will not ever be enough. So I think just politicizing the community and raising awareness is one way to go, but much more needs to happen beyond that.
Okay, our next question is for all of you, and it's from Hiwaraat Aruch, but it's giving me a little bit of like PTSD from my graduate student like orals exams. I'm still going to ask. If we agree with Hart and Negri's argument that empire is now total and supranational, what would this tell us about contemporary practices and strategies of Islamophobia? Remember your Hart and Negri.
Yeah, that was like, yeah, I remember I read that maybe 15 years ago. I mean, first off, I think, you know, the sort of major argument of this book, which is for those of younger audience members might not recall it, but it was sort of a big deal like in the early 2000s, was that, you know, basically the sort of classic mode of spatially bounded empires, you know, in the 19th and 20th century, many of these had a sort of national core, had been superseded by this sort of agglomerated capitalist, sort of globe-spanning capitalist empire. I don't know. I mean, I tend to think that the events of the last 20 years kind of show that was a little bit overstated, and kind of, you know, various forms of reterritorialization show us that kind of thinking about kind of distinct empires, even within kind of global marketplaces and flows of labor and people that have been increasingly integrated. I think that there's still a value of thinking about, you know, different empires and the ways that, yeah, that they may practice Islamophobia. So I guess, you know, I'm not really giving an answer to the question as much as kind of saying that I don't think we should kind of do away with this idea that there are kind of distinct imperial identities in the 21st century.
Anybody else want to tackle that? No. Okay.
I'll take a crack at
Okay.
it. Okay.
Go ahead.
Thanks for bringing up Hart and Negri, because I think it's a useful way to bring a conversation, instead of simply talking about agendas and interests. I think it's useful to talk about capitalism and neoliberalism and the ways in which the UAE or Qatar or any of these other emirate nations actually have an interest in the neoliberal project, right? I think it's not enough just to talk about the political. It's important to root the political within the economic. And to the extent that Hart and Negri bring us to a question of empire as not simply a political entity, but an economic entity, that's a useful thing to do. That said, I think the idea, which was quite dominant in globalism studies back in the late 1990s and 2000, which is the idea that corporations are now empires. The nation state is dead, the nation state is weak, blah, blah, blah. I was part of the global justice movement, the battle in Seattle. We were getting ready to go to Washington, D.C. to take down the WTO in September of 2001, and guess what happens, right? And all of a sudden, the folks who are arguing that states are dead and capital is what rules the world, now see a powerful capitalist state establishing its power around the world. And so, unfortunately, it had a huge impact on the movement. It wasn't until Occupy Wall Street that the global justice movement would be revived because of a weak theory of the nation state. Nevertheless, I do think, and so, we show up on September 25th, I think. We were expecting 500,000 people. There were 5,000 of us because that movement was ended. But in its place, of course, we turned our attention to building the anti-war movement. But I do think it's important to come back to the priorities of neoliberalism and the ways in which the war on terror, Islamophobia, regulating Muslims, policing Muslim terrorists, and all the laws and policies that came into being in that context have now been diverted against other threats to capital, other threats to neoliberalism. I just finished a paper on protesters in Atlanta, a $90 million, 85-acre police training center. It's called Cop City. And protesters have been encamped, environmentalists, along with racial justice activists and so on, and dozens of them involved in civil disobedience, right? Sitting in trees, encamped in trees, have been arrested as terrorists. So you see how useful anti-terrorism, counter-terrorism laws, which the face of which was Muslims back in 2001, now becomes a useful way in which the Atlanta Police Foundation, a private entity consisting of Home Depot and all the other corporations who don't want to see unionization, who don't want to see protests against their policies, their environmental degradation, and so on. That's how the war on terror, Islamophobia, its policies interface with and link with the regulatory and policing powers of the state today. And so thank you for the question about Hart and Negri, because I do think we have to talk about capital, about neoliberalism, and how all these mesh together.
Mm-hmm. Go ahead. I was going to actually maybe ask you a question, Professor Hashemi. One of the things that the UAE has done is it's obviously deeply involved in the normalization efforts with Israel. Mm-hmm. It's also involved in the settler colonial project in Kashmir because the different memorandums of understanding that the Indian government, most of them have been signed by the UAE. They want to build malls, of course, that's what they do in Kashmir. And so the other interesting thing that happened a couple years ago, though, is that a BJP leader in India made comments against the Prophet Muhammad. And it got to the attention of some UAE royals, and they actually intervened and told the Indian government that you should sack this person because this is unacceptable. And Narendra Modi, who does not listen to anyone, really, actually did that. That BJP leader was sacked, removed from his position. So I think that this point about then the neoliberal capital and how it's really integral is really important. So of course it's about autocratic governments and going against expressions of Islam, but do you think that neoliberal capital also plays a role in at least the normalization deals or what it's doing with India?
Yeah, I think that's fundamentally what empire is about, what authoritarian regimes, they want to strengthen their stranglehold in their own societies by, expanding their economic base. And so if that means, engaging with regimes that are persecuting Muslims, then that's perfectly fine. So in the context of the relationship between the UAE and India, you should all know that in, I think, 2019, the UAE rolled out the red carpet for Modi and gave the Prime Minister of India the highest civilian honor that the Emirates has for foreign leaders, and they gave it to Modi in a big ceremony at the exact moment where Muslims are facing persecution. And this is not limited to the United Arab Emirates. It actually extends to many, and I would argue actually most Muslim countries around the world, and it manifests itself specifically in the context of the persecution and the genocide against the Uyghurs in China. So in 2019, at the height of the genocide against the Uyghurs in China, the Organization of Islamic Cooperation meets in Abu Dhabi, the foreign ministers meeting, and they pass a resolution and I'm quoting from the resolution, they pass a resolution, quote, commending China for its treatment of its Muslim citizens, looking forward to further cooperation between the OIC and the People's Republic of China. And all of the leaders of all of the major Muslim states have traveled to China during the Uyghur genocide and embraced Xi Jinping and said wonderful things about his rule. Go to Xinjiang province. And the reason why they're doing this, I think fundamentally, one, it's because of the economic relationship that they want to expand with China, because they think that will give them options. But it's also, I think, the reason why these Muslim autocrats like China is they like the Chinese model of governance. China is a big power. It has a surveillance state. Anytime anyone criticizes China for its human rights record, China pushes back. Many of these Muslim autocrats want to emulate the Chinese Communist Party. They want to present themselves as sort of strong states. Don't criticize us for how we treat our citizens. If you want to engage with us economically, we're happy to have that conversation with you. And so that's the attraction that I think China has for many of these Muslim autocrats. And of course, it comes at the expense of the Uyghurs. And I think the Uyghur situation is so tragic that we're having something happening before our eyes that has never happened in the history of Islam, where you have a persecuted population facing genocide, and you have Muslim country after Muslim country, of course I'm talking about the leaders, not the people, actively involved in the persecution of that Muslim population. If you think about the key moments in Islamic history where there was mass suffering and Muslim persecution, the Crusades, the Mongol sacking of Baghdad, the Reconquista of the Iberian Peninsula, I can't think of any historical moment where you had Muslims who were so actively involved in persecuting and justifying the persecution, and in this case, the annihilation of another group of Muslims. But today, that's happening actively before our eyes, and there's no accountability. And that, I think, just highlights how dark this particular moment in Islamic history is. I mean, these are the dark days of Islamic history, and I think the persecution of the Uyghurs and the active collaboration of many Muslim governments in that persecution just is recognition of how bad this moment in Islamic history is. And so we have to acknowledge it, but of course, I always try and sort of say something positive. The fact that we could gather here and have these conversations, that there is a space where Muslims and others can come together to talk about the collective plight of the Muslim world, that's room for optimism. And so let's celebrate that opportunity, let's build on that opportunity, but let's also not lose sight of the fact about how bad the situation is, not only for the Uyghurs in China, but across the Islamic world. You know, these are the authoritarian governments are strong, civil societies are weak, democratic forces are, struggling. We had one democracy in the Arab world in Tunisia, and look what's happened in Tunisia. Rashid Ghannouchi is in prison. He's on a hunger strike. That's a reminder of how bad things are.
Can I ask a follow-up question? When you're talking about this, would you put the increased normalization of Arab states with Israel in that category?
Oh yeah,
as well?
it's a perfect illustration, because it's happening at the expense of the Palestinians. And it doesn't matter how hawkish the Israeli government is, right? I would suspect if tomorrow, there was a mass expulsion of Palestinians from the West Bank, there would probably be a momentary pause in the normalization with Israel, but it won't change the equation. So I think the open embrace of these authoritarian regimes, undermining previous positions that they held with respect to the Palestinians, right? I mean, the previous Arab peace plan was that, look, no normalization with Israel until the Palestinians get justice. Now, led by the UAE, but embraced by Saudi Arabia and other authoritarian regimes. In fact, one can even take it back to Anwar Sadat. That's where it actually began. Jordan follows suit. It's a complete abandonment of the Palestinians. And so what's going to happen, I was just saying this to someone a moment ago, mark my words, within the next year, most likely, there's going to be a major celebration in Washington, D.C. Joe Biden is going to welcome MBS and Benjamin Netanyahu. They're going to hug, they're going to shake hands, and then it's going to be proclaimed that peace has arrived in the Middle East. We can all go home. It's a wonderful situation. And if you listen to the narrative, to add insult to injury, what's so tragic about this narrative is they're saying, well, if Saudi Arabia normalizes relations with Israel, that means the rest of the Muslim world can now normalize relations with Israel. And the issue is solved, as if Mohammed bin Salman represents all Muslims around the world, and
Well,
just
again,
because
sir,
he wants to throw Muslims under the bus.
You're speaking in Qatar here.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, of course, we can have this conversation in Qatar, right? But this narrative that just because Saudi Arabia sells the Palestinians, down, throws them under the bus, that somehow that means that the rest of the Muslim world is supposed to give up on their support for the Palestinians. I mean, but that's what you hear in the West. That's the State Department and the Israeli talking point. But of course, it makes no sense if you have any connection with the realities on the ground in Muslim societies. But this, unfortunately, is the world that we live in.
Okay, I have plenty of questions about Saudi I wish I could get to, but I'm going to go back to the audience questions. What is the impact of a multipolar world on growing Islamophobia? That's to everyone.
The impact of a multipolar world on Islamophobia?
Mm-hmm.
Well, if that means Russia and China, it means that, I don't think it really changes anything. In many ways, it just sort of confirms what the point that I made before about China. Yeah, we have, China as a major power, but China is also the site of arguably the worst case of Islamophobia on the planet today. India is a rising power. Okay, maybe it's it's part of this multipolar equation. Look what India and Modi are doing to Muslims. So I don't think it changes anything because the politics of empire sort of reproduces the types of themes that I just spoke about a moment ago. I don't think it really helps with combating Islamophobia. What helps with combating Islamophobia is, I think, organized programs to push back against it. I think fundamentally there's no solution to the problem of Islamophobia unless it's deeply connected with projects of democratization.
I'll just add one thing, if I may, which is the BRICS recently added several countries, and there are people on the left who are celebrating this as somehow,
A transformative moment.
Yeah, a transformative moment, comparing it to Bandung, if you will, right? Bandung is the moment when the non-aligned movement was formed of, nations that neither wanted to align with the American empire or the Russian empire and so on. That is not what BRICS plus all these new nations are at all. First of all, for the reasons you mentioned around Russia and China and India, but also the fact that they represent, whoever's question that is, it is a multipolar world. There's no doubt about it. This is the unipolar moment of the early 90s when the Soviet Union collapsed and so on is long gone. I think that's absolutely right. But I don't think that the multipolarity and the fact of the BRICS nations plus whoever else they've invited truly represents resistance in the way that, the non-aligned movement, which came out of anti-colonial struggles and which represented, in some ways, very limited ways, anti-imperialism, that was a different moment. And I think it's very important not to celebrate the BRICS plus, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah, I would just maybe add that I think it actually even further forecloses the possibility of actual genuine Muslim sovereignty in different parts of the world. And especially with BRICS, those countries are not supposed to comment on each other's internal affairs. So they can have all of the trade deals, negotiations, currency, et cetera, but the human rights violations, war crimes, et cetera, will not be touched. So.
Yeah, I mean, the only follow-up I have to those comments, and this is certainly not advocacy of a unipolar world, because we all know that that has not looked great either. But that is to say that multipolarity, the surveillance and military technological mechanisms that have been turned against Muslim populations in such a drastic fashion in the last couple decades, those are largely the byproduct of multipolarity during the Cold War, right? These are defense and surveillance systems that were built up and rationalized through great power competition. And then when they had no place to look, they were turned elsewhere. So, multipolarity oftentimes, also leads to kind of one of the byproducts of it is rearmament, is increased surveillance, other things like this. So I mean, I can only see it kind of inflecting in negative ways in that sense.
This question is to Hafsa. reclaiming indigeneity can also fall into the trap of ethno-nationalist Islam that other speakers talked about. How can we deal with this?
Yeah, I think, that's part of what I wanted to get near the end of the question is that the presentation is that even as Muslim indigeneity has been erased or it's been used as a justification to deny Muslim belonging to certain places, I'm not sure if indigeneity is a category that would fully work for us in our attempts to decolonize or to have self-determination. So there might be other categories that are more useful, but that's just actually an open question, maybe for the panel as well. How to think through that without reverting back to ethno-nationalism.
May I? Actually, on the previous question, I realized I was talking about BRICS without explaining what BRICS is. BRICS is the bloc of Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. And the countries that they have invited to join their little coalition are Argentina, Egypt, Ethiopia, Iran, Saudi Arabia, and the UAE. So those who see the inclusion of Muslim-majority countries into the BRICS bloc as somehow being, the basis from which Islamophobia is going to now be fought, no, it's not happening.
Let me ask a question about going back to Saudi, because I've been working on this chapter on Saudi in the United States, including the fact that right after World War II, the United States military trains the Saudi military, and a few years later, Aramco calls in the military to break asks the Saudi government to bring in this new trained military to break one of the strikes, right? I want to ask about this kind of Saudi exception, but also what's been happening lately, where it's almost like Saudi has been using accusations of Islamophobia, right? And kind of turning it on its head in order to rehabilitate its image. And then I also have questions about this idea of military weapons, right? Not just military training, but how that has functioned in all of this. Anybody?
Could you say a bit more about how Saudi Arabia is using accusations of Islamophobia, turning it on its head for its own purposes?
What I mean is that let me give you an example. When I came to Qatar, a question I would get a lot is, are you allowed to drive? And I would say, no, that's in Saudi, right? And even some of my Qatari students would love to say, we're not like Saudi, right? Because Saudi is the example, or used to be the example, of the worst kind of extremist Islam, right? In this imaginary. It seems like MBS is doing something very different now, right? He is trying to rehabilitate Saudi's image by saying, look how great I am with women, now I'm letting them drive, right? So I guess my question is, how is he using that, right? Is he using these tropes to his own advantage?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. I mean, clearly he has changed Saudi Arabia for Saudi citizens in significant ways that mark a contrast from previous Saudi rulers. But at the same time, he's also doing other things that need to be included if we're talking about the policies of MBS. He's also arresting women's rights activists. He's also arresting people for tweeting and condemning them to death. He's also committing war crimes in Yemen. And he's also committing, crimes against humanity against Ethiopian migrants who are crossing over the Yemenis borders and supporting a lot of, the counter Arab Spring Revolution and a lot of other ugly things. So that is part of the old package. But I think very much part of the strategy of MBS is to cater to public opinion in the West and say, look, I'm this enlightened leader. Okay, I might be a bit harsh on human rights activists, but I'm changing Saudi Arabia. I'm pushing it back against the, the image that existed. And so come and do business with me. The problem is that, Saudi, I think at the end of the day, MBS, does display elements of a psychotic behavior, a paranoid behavior. I think he's an unhinged figure. And because he has power concentrated in his hands, you're going to see more of these types of policies. So I think that's what we can expect going forward, sort of, attempt to liberalize to a certain extent, but within very narrow confines, no political liberalization. And anyone who speaks out, anyone who criticizes Saudi Arabia, will find themselves in jail or on death row. I mean, we should also mention in the context of, MBS's plan, Saudi Arabia ranks, third in the world for state-sanctioned executions after China and Iran. I mean, that is also part of the, the MBS modernization plan. So I think we have to look at it in its comprehensive, form, not just focus on the parts that MBS wants us to focus on.
Let me turn that back to you as well, Karine, which is, I think MBS can learn in some ways from what Erdogan has done, which is, the Gezi Park protests are being ruthlessly put down. And yet, many of us in the US and in the UK got invitations at the office of Foreign Affairs to come and speak about Islamophobia. And it was such a naked and blatant attempt to get us to whitewash what was going on, to use our credibility. And, I don't know who went, but I certainly decided not to go. But that's such a clever way, isn't it, to bring academics who study Islamophobia to shield the state, the authoritarian state, from criticisms of its human rights violations by claiming that anyone who says something about the government is Islamophobic. So to the extent that MBS wants to sort of, present himself in that way, he could take a page from Erdogan on how to do this. So is that happening at all? I mean, all I know is when I tried to get a visa to go study Saudi Arabia, it was impossible. I tried for 4 or 5 years and they would not let me in. So I don't know if things have changed on that front. I think they have, but I'm not sure.
I never tried to get into the Aramco archives because I thought that was never going to happen. But I do have to say that I think it's fascinating that Saudi Arabia is both the biggest target of American attacks on Islam, but also has this, a special relationship with the United States in ways that we only see with one other country in the world, right? Which I think we're about out of time, so I'm going to wrap up there. And thank you again all for your amazing presentations.